She was 20 and penniless, cast out by her own blood. With no family left to claim her and no plan to follow, she had only a worn leather satchel, a brass plumb bob that had belonged to her father, and 19 shillings. Her sisters had taken the house, the business, and the money, but in their haste they had overlooked a single folded deed to a waterlogged parcel of land on the edge of Harswick. It was a place they deemed worthless, but what nobody knew was that beneath the silted reeds and stagnant water lay the one inheritance their father had always meant for the daughter who understood the quiet language of moving earth and flowing water. Stay with us for this story, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Frances Ward had grown up not in the drawing room with her sisters, Eleanor and Beatrice, but in the workshop and the field with her father. Thomas Ward was a civil engineer, a man whose name was spoken with respect by the landowners and fen drainage committees of Lincolnshire. He was a builder of sea walls, a cutter of canals, a master of sluices and weirs. While Eleanor learned needlepoint and Beatrice practiced the pianoforte, Frances learned the properties of oak versus elm, the tolerances of cast iron, and the elegant mathematics of hydrology. Her hands, unlike her sisters, were not soft. They were competent, often smudged with graphite from drafting pencils or stained with the grease he used to protect his tools. Her mentor was her father, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who smelled of damp earth and pipe tobacco. He never praised her with effusive words, but his approval was a solid and reassuring presence. It was in the way he would hand her his own micrometer to check a measurement, or ask her opinion on the angle of a new drainage ditch. He taught her that the world was a system of pressures and flows, of balances that could be understood and, with care, managed. "Water always seeks its level, Frankie," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Your job is not to fight it, but to show it the most sensible way to go." The beloved object she carried everywhere was a brass plumb bob, heavy and cool in her palm. It was his first gift to her, given on her 10th birthday. It was not a toy, but a tool, perfectly machined, with a fine, sharp point. It was a thing of purpose and integrity. It represented to her the core of her father's philosophy: find the true vertical, the point of honest balance, and build from there. When her mother had been alive, there was a fragile peace in the house, a buffer between Thomas Ward's practical world and the socially ambitious one his wife and elder daughters inhabited. But after the fever took her, the house cleaved in two. Eleanor and Beatrice, guided by a coterie of aunts, turned their full attention to securing advantageous marriages, seeing their father's work as merely the grubby source of the funds that paid for their gowns and their dowries. They did not understand the quiet pride he took in a well-seated gear or a perfectly sealed culvert. They saw only mud on his boots. Frances saw the genius. She saw the way his work kept the fields from flooding, the livestock from drowning, the villages from being swept away by the unforgiving North Sea tides. She saw the respect in the eyes of the farmers and the foremen who came to their door, not to pay social calls, but to seek his counsel. His death, when it came, was sudden. A chill caught on a windswept dike, turning to pneumonia within a week. He was gone before Frances could properly say goodbye, before he could finalize the new will he had been drafting, the one he had told her would make things right. The ejection was a quiet, bloodless affair conducted in the cold formality of a solicitor's office. Mr. Finch, a man whose face seemed composed entirely of gray, pursed lips, read from the existing will, an old document drafted years before, when Frances was just a child. It was simple and, to Eleanor and Beatrice, eminently fair. The estate, including the family home in Lincoln, the engineering business with its contracts and equipment, and all cash holdings, was to be divided equally between his two eldest daughters. Frances was mentioned only in a brief codicil, bequeathing to her the sum of £100 for her upkeep. Her sisters, now married to men of commerce who understood figures on a ledger far better than they understood the flow of water, had already made their calculations. The business was sold to a London firm. The house was to be cleared and put on the market. Their husbands, flanking them like a pair of glossy crows, nodded in sober agreement with Mr. Finch. £100 is a generous settlement, Frances, Eleanor said, not unkindly, but with the detached air of someone closing a household account. It will be quite sufficient for you to find a respectable position as a governess or a lady's companion. Beatrice added, Perhaps in the south. The climate is more agreeable. They did not see the dismissal for the profound cruelty it was. In their minds, they were being practical. Frances was unmarried, with no prospects. She was a liability to be settled, a loose end to be tied. She did not argue. She did not weep or plead. To do so would have been to dishonor the memory of the man who had taught her to face problems with quiet competence, not with hysterics. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of the plumb bob in her pocket a small, cold anchor in a world that was dissolving around her. There is one other item, Mr. Finch said, peering over his spectacles as he shuffled through a small stack of lesser documents. A deed for a small parcel of land near Harswick, the Harswick Sluice property. It seems to have negligible value. The land is marshy, unsuitable for grazing or tillage. The structure on it is noted as derelict. He slid the stiff, folded parchment across the polished mahogany table. As it is not explicitly mentioned in the division of the primary estate, and as your sisters have expressed no interest, it is, by default, yours. Eleanor's husband, a portly textiles merchant, scoffed lightly. A swamp. What use is a swamp? Frances reached out and took the deed. The paper was thick, the ink faded but still legible. She recognized her father's precise, angular signature at the bottom. She said nothing, merely nodded her acceptance. She signed the papers, relinquishing her claim to any other part of the estate in exchange for her £100 and the deed. She walked out of the solicitor's office and did not look back. That evening, she packed. It did not take long. She had her father's books on engineering and hydraulics, a change of sturdy clothes, and her satchel of drafting tools. She placed the brass plumb bob carefully into a small wooden box. The house was already becoming a foreign place, filled with the murmurs of appraisers and the rustle of her sister's plans. She left before dawn, a note on the hall table her only farewell. She had £97, having spent £3 on a new pair of waterproof boots and a deed to a place she had never seen. The journey to Harswick was a slow, deliberate unwinding of the life she had known. She traveled not by the swift mail coach, which she could not afford, but by a series of local carriers' carts, sharing the rough wooden benches with farmers' wives, itinerant laborers, and crates of chickens. Each mile took her deeper into the flat, expansive landscape of the Lincolnshire fens, a world her father had known intimately. The sky was immense, a shifting canvas of gray and pearl, and the horizon was a stark, unbroken line, punctuated only by the occasional church spire or the dark silhouette of a wind pump. The air grew damp and tasted of salt and wet earth. She listened to the conversations around her, the talk of crop prices, of flooding in the low-lying fields, of the constant, wearying battle against the water. The names of the villages were familiar to her from her father's maps: Dogdyke, Chapel St. Leonard's, Wrangle. She felt not like a stranger, but like someone returning to a land she knew only through paper and ink. After 2 days, the final cart left her at a crossroads a mile from Harswick. The carrier, a man with a face weathered like old leather, pointed down a muddy track. "That be the way. Don't know why anyone'd be heading to the old sluice. Nothing there but reeds and ruin." Frances thanked him, shouldered her satchel, and began to walk. The lane was little more than 2 deep ruts in the dark, peaty soil. On either side, drainage ditches, choked with weeds and algae, ran parallel to the track. The fields beyond were sodden, great pools of standing water reflecting the bruised colors of the evening sky. She could see what the carrier meant. This was land that was losing its fight. The air was thick with the cries of wading birds and the hum of insects. As she drew closer, she could smell it. The scent of decay, of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. And then she saw it. Set back from the lane, half hidden by a stand of skeletal willows, was a small, squat building of weathered gray stone. Its slate roof was bowed in the middle like a tired old horse, and a chimney at one end listed at a precarious angle. Beside it, a broader channel of water, almost a canal, was spanned by a hulking structure of timber and iron, the sluice gate. It was larger than she had expected, a testament to a time when this artery had been vital. Now, it was a monument to neglect. The massive oak beams were green with moss, and the winding gear was a tangle of rust. The water on the inland side was high, dark, and still, held back by the decaying gate, while the channel leading out to the distant sea marshes was little more than a muddy trickle. She had arrived. This was her inheritance. This small, forgotten corner of the world, slowly being reclaimed by the water it was built to control, was all that was left of her father's legacy. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. It was not despair. It was the quiet focus of a problem to be solved. She approached the cottage, her new boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. This was the place her sisters had dismissed as worthless, and as she stood before it, the deed in her hand, she understood that its true value was not something that could ever be recorded on a ledger. The cottage was small, comprised of only 2 rooms on the ground floor and a low-ceilinged loft above. The key was not in the lock, but the iron latch, though rusted, was not seized. With a firm push of her shoulder, the thick plank door scraped open over the stone flags of the floor. A wave of cold, damp air washed over her, carrying the scent of mildew, old smoke, and something else. The faint, clean smell of river silt. Light from the single grimy window in the main room was thin and gray, revealing a space that had been empty for a very long time. A thick layer of dust and grime coated every surface. In the center of the room stood a simple pine table and 2 chairs, one of which had collapsed into a small pile of splintered wood. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, its gaping mouth black with the soot of 1,000 long-dead fires. Cobwebs, thick as spun wool, hung from the ceiling beams. Everything was decay, yet the structure itself felt solid. The stone walls were sound. The main timbers of the roof, as far as she could see, were intact. This was not a ruin. It was a place that had been sleeping. She ran a hand over the cold stone of the fireplace. It was a well-built hearth, the stones expertly fitted. Her father would have approved. In the second, smaller room, there was a simple bed frame of rusted iron and a small chest of drawers, its veneer peeling away in curling strips. She opened a drawer. It was empty, save for a desiccated mouse. She climbed the steep, ladder-like stairs to the loft. It was dark and smelled of dust and ancient birds' nests. A few rays of light pierced the gloom through missing slates in the roof. The floor was covered in a thick carpet of debris, twigs, dried leaves, and the droppings of generations of starlings. But it was dry. The bowed roof had held. For the rest of the afternoon, she worked. She unlatched and forced open the windows, letting in the damp air and the fading light. Using a piece of the broken chair as a scraper, she began to clear the thickest of the grime from the floor and the table. She found a dilapidated broom in a corner and swept the stone flags, raising a choking cloud of dust. She was not cleaning a house. She was performing an assessment. She was taking measure of what was broken, what was salvageable, and what was strangely beautiful beneath the neglect. The stone of the floor, once swept, revealed itself to be smooth, worn into gentle hollows by the passage of feet over decades. The table, though filthy, was made of solid, honest pine. The iron window frames were rusted, but their hinges still moved. This place had been built to last. As dusk fell, she turned her attention to the hearth. A fire was the first priority. It would fight the damp, provide light, and make this empty shell feel like a shelter. She gathered fallen branches from the willows outside, breaking them into manageable lengths. Inside, she cleared the grate of old ash and debris, and as she did, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, wedged deep at the back of the firebox, behind the iron fireback. It was a small tin box, no larger than a book. The tin box was heavy for its size, its surface pitted with rust, but its seams still sound. It took Frances a few minutes of patient work with the tip of her knife to pry the lid open. The sound it made was a low groan of yielding metal, a sound that had not been heard for many years. Inside, there was no treasure in the conventional sense. There were no jewels, no glittering pile of sovereigns. Instead, neatly wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a small leather-bound ledger, a bundle of letters tied with faded twine, and a small, heavy canvas bag. A faint, dry scent of paper and ink rose from the box, a scent of preserved memory. She opened the canvas bag first. It did not chink, but made a soft, heavy thud on the table. Inside were not coins, but a set of precisely machined brass and steel objects. They were specialized tools, calipers, gauges, a small, intricate spirit level, and several strangely shaped keys. They were the custom tools for servicing the winding gear of the sluice. They were clean, coated in a thin layer of protective grease, ready for use. Her breath caught in her throat. This was not a random cache. It was a legacy. She picked up the bundle of letters. The hand was her father's, the same angular, practical script she knew from his workbooks. They were addressed not to her, but to Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith in Harswick, and to Mr. Granger, whose farm bordered the sluice property. They were letters of instruction, detailing the maintenance schedule for the gate, the agreed-upon rates for water management, and the transfer of responsibility. They were dated only a month before his death. He had been making plans. Finally, she opened the ledger. The first page contained a meticulous drawing of the sluice mechanism, with every part labeled. The following pages were filled with columns of figures, records of water levels, tide times, and rainfall, going back 20 years. It was a complete operational history of the Harswick Sluice, and tucked into the very last page was a single folded sheet of paper. It was a letter, and this one was addressed to her. "My dearest Frankie," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has proven to be as I suspected it would. Your sisters are good women, but they do not see the value in things that cannot be easily counted in a London bank. They do not understand the worth of a well-drained field, a secure foundation, or a gate that holds against the tide. But you do. This place, this cottage, and this sluice is your inheritance. It is not much to look at now, but it is the key to this land. The farmers here depend on it, though they may have forgotten its importance. With the tools in the box and the knowledge in this ledger, you can make it work again. The letters will explain the arrangements I was making. It will provide a small, honest living. More than that, it will provide a purpose. I have left something for you as well. Look to the northeast corner of the loft, beneath the loose floorboard under the eaves. It is not a fortune, but it is a start. Be brave, my girl. You have my hands and my heart. You know how to find the true vertical. Build from there. Your loving father, Thomas Ward. Tears, hot and silent, finally traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. It was not a cry of grief, but of profound, aching recognition. He had seen her. He had known her. And he had not abandoned her. Following his instructions, she took a candle up to the loft. In the northeast corner, under the deep eaves, one of the rough-sawn floorboards was indeed loose. She lifted it. In the cavity below, nestled in clean, dry straw, was a heavy cloth bag. This one did clink. Inside were 50 golden sovereigns. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy materials, to hire help, to live for a year. It was the foundation he had left for her. The first sovereign was spent in the village of Harswick the next morning. Frances walked the mile to the small collection of stone houses and shops, her father's letter to the blacksmith clutched in her hand. Mr. Abernathy was a man well past 60, with arms as thick as oak branches and a face that seemed to have been forged from the same metal he worked. He looked at her with suspicion from beneath bushy white eyebrows as she entered the smoky warmth of his smithy. She did not explain her life story. She simply handed him the letter. He wiped his hands on a leather apron and read it, his lips moving silently. His expression softened from skepticism to a deep, weary sadness. "Thomas Ward," he said, his voice a low rasp. "A good man. An honest man. I heard he had passed. A great loss to the Fens." He looked from the letter to her. "You're his girl, the one he spoke of?" Frances nodded. "I am Frances." "He said you had his hands," the blacksmith grunted, looking at her own, which were calloused and capable. "He was right. This letter, he wanted me to forge a new spindle for the main gear. Said the old one had a fracture." He ran a hand through his shock of white hair. "That was months ago. The work is still needed, miss. The whole mechanism is seizing up. But it will cost." "I can pay," Frances said simply, laying one of the heavy gold coins on his anvil. The blacksmith stared at the sovereign, then back at her. A slow smile spread across his face. "Aye," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "I believe you can." That was the beginning. The rebuilding of the Harswick Sluice was not a single grand act, but 100 small, interlocking tasks, each one requiring patience and precision. Her first job was to clear the channel. The waterway was choked with years of accumulated silt and reeds, a thick, glutinous mud that blocked the flow. She bought a scythe and a long-handled rake in the village, and began the back-breaking work of cutting and dragging. For days, she worked from dawn until dusk, standing thigh-deep in the cold, brown water, her muscles screaming in protest. A local farmer, Mr. Granger, the recipient of the second letter, came to watch her on the third day. He was a tall, stooped man with worried eyes, His fields, the very ones she had seen waterlogged on her walk from the crossroads. He watched her for a full hour, saying nothing. Finally he called out, his voice gruff. "That's a fool's task for one person." "It is a necessary task," she replied, not pausing in her work. The next morning, he returned with his 2 sons and a pair of heavy draft horses. They brought with them a dredging scoop, a heavy iron bucket on a long pole. Without a word of negotiation, they set to work, the horses straining against the weight of the mud, achieving more in 1 hour than she had in 3 days. By the end of the week, the channel was clear. As the water level on the inland side dropped, the full extent of the damage to the sluice gate was revealed. The main oak beams were sound at their core, protected by the water that had threatened to destroy them, but the smaller planks were rotten. The ironwork was seized with rust. With Mr. Abernathy's help, she began the careful process of disassembly. Using the specialized keys from her father's box, she unlocked the service plates and began to dismantle the winding gear. She cleaned each gear, each cog, each pinion, scraping away the rust, oiling them with tallow, and reassembling them with the meticulous care her father had taught her. Mr. Abernathy forged the new spindle, its surface a gleaming, dark gunmetal gray. Together they fitted it into the gear housing, the fit so perfect it slid into place with a satisfying, final thud. Mrs. Gable, a widow who lived in the cottage nearest the crossroads, began leaving a hot meat pie and a small jug of ale on the cottage doorstep for her each day, never waiting for thanks, just a quiet act of sustenance. The community was coalescing around the work, drawn not by pleas for help, but by the sight of competence and determination. Slowly, methodically, the Harswick sluice came back to life. Francis hired a carpenter from the next village, a man named Silas Croft, to replace the rotten planking on the gate. She worked alongside him, learning to wield an adze and a mallet, to cut mortise and tenon joints that would hold against the immense pressure of the water. She paid him from her father's sovereigns, and he in turn taught her the ways of wood as her father had taught her the ways of iron and stone. She learned to read the grain, to know where a piece of oak would be strongest, how to seal the joints with pitch and hemp. The work on the cottage proceeded in parallel. After long days on the sluice, she would spend her evenings indoors. She reglazed the broken window panes, buying the glass in town and teaching herself to fix it in place with putty. She mixed lime plaster and repaired the crumbling walls, the slow, rhythmic sweep of the trowel a calming counterpoint to the heavy labor of the day. She bought a small cast-iron stove to replace the inefficient hearth, and its steady warmth finally drove the last of the damp from the stone walls. Her life found its own rhythm, dictated by the tides and the seasons. People in the village no longer looked at her with curiosity, but with a quiet, accepting respect. She was no longer a stranger. She was Miss Ward, the sluice keeper. The farmers, led by Mr. Granger, came to her to formalize the agreement her father had proposed in his letter. They would pay her a quarterly fee, a modest but sufficient sum, to manage the water levels, to open the sluice on the ebb tide to drain their fields, and to hold it fast against the surge of the spring tides that threatened to inundate the land with salt water. She was not just their employee, she was their guardian. Her knowledge, passed down from her father and earned through her own hard work, was the only thing standing between their livelihood and the encroaching sea. She kept her father's ledger, adding her own entries in a neat, clear hand that was almost the twin of his. She recorded the rainfall, the height of the tides, the number of hours the gate was open. The book was no longer just a history. It was a living document, a conversation across time between a father and his daughter. The small cottage, once derelict, became a home. Mrs. Gable gave her cuttings from her own garden, and Frances planted them along the cottage wall. Lavender, thyme, and hardy climbing roses. The scent of herbs replaced the smell of mildew. She bought a few pieces of simple, sturdy furniture in the market town, a comfortable chair to place by the fire, a new bed frame, a shelf for her father's books. The community settled around her, not with grand gestures, but with the small, repeated acts of ordinary life. Mr. Abernathy would stop by on his way home to share a pipe and talk about the weather. Mr. Granger's wife would send over a loaf of fresh bread or a pot of jam. Children on their way to the river to fish would call out a greeting. She had become a part of the landscape, as fixed and as necessary as the sluice gate itself. She was home. One crisp autumn evening, with the scent of coal smoke hanging in the still air, Frances stood on the walkway atop the sluice gate. The mechanism was fully restored, the new oak planks dark with linseed oil, the ironwork black and gleaming. Below her, the water flowed through the open gate in a smooth, powerful current, draining the fields out toward the distant estuary. The sound was no longer the choked gurgle of a blocked drain, but the clean, deep-throated whisper of a river breathing freely. The sky was the color of a fading bruise, streaked with pink and gold, and the lights of the village were beginning to twinkle in the distance. The cottage behind her was a place of warmth and welcome, a thin ribbon of smoke rising straight up from its chimney. In her hand, she held the brass plumb bob her father had given her so many years ago. Its weight was familiar, comforting. She let it hang, its fine point indicating the true, unwavering vertical, a perfect line of integrity against the vast, flat landscape. She thought of her sisters, Eleanor and Beatrice, in their fine houses, surrounded by objects of calculated value. They had taken what they believed to be the whole of their father's estate, the money, the business, the solid, respectable assets. They had left her with what they saw as worthless, a patch of mud, a pile of rocks, a broken machine. They had never understood that their father's true legacy was not in what could be bought or sold, but in what could be built and maintained. It was in the knowledge of how to make things work, how to bring order to chaos, how to hold the line against the encroaching tide. The tools he had left her were not just the calipers and gauges in the tin box, but the skills in her hands and the understanding in her mind. He had not left her a fortune to be spent. He had left her a purpose to be lived. She thought of the letter he had hidden in the hearth, a message of faith from a man who knew his own daughter better than anyone. He had trusted her to see the potential where others saw only decay. He had trusted her to find her own balance, her own true vertical, and to build a life from it. On the windowsill in her cottage, beside a small vase of wildflowers, sat the tin box he had left for her. Next to it, she had placed the brass plumb bob. One was a secret kept for her, the other a gift given openly. Together they told the whole story. They were objects from a man who had loved his daughter, not for the advantageous match she might make, but for the capable woman she already was. Frances Ward was 21 years old, and she was not penniless. She had a home, a livelihood, and the respect of her community. She had 19 shillings and a worthless deed to her name when she arrived, and she had spent it on reclaiming her inheritance. It was the best investment she ever made. What we discard as worthless often holds the very thing we need, if only we have the eyes to see it. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might also find value in the forgotten corners of life. And we'd love to hear from you. What is something you've seen value in when others saw none?